On a crisp, golden autumn afternoon, the lobby of Crestwood National Bank is alive with activity. People bustle around, discussing their transactions, tapping on their phones, or simply waiting their turn. Among them walks Gerald, a dignified elderly black man whose kind eyes reflect years of experience. His face, weathered by time and the struggles of life, tells the story of resilience. In his hand, he carries a well-worn briefcase, a sign of years of use and countless journeys. His slow, deliberate steps are purposeful, yet there is an air of calmness in his movements. The employees at the counter, Sarah and Jason, both in their early 30s, are engaged in a light conversation when they notice Gerald approaching. As he makes his way toward them, they exchange a brief glance, an unspoken judgment passing between them. There's something about Gerald's presence that doesn't quite fit their preconceived notions of who belongs in the bank's sleek, modern space. Gerald approaches the counter with a respectful, yet confident air. With a polite smile, he asks if they can assist him with a matter regarding his account. But Sarah, who is still distracted, raises an eyebrow and casts a skeptical glance at him. She questions, almost dismissively, whether Gerald even has an account with the bank, given his appearance and age. Jason, standing next to her, shifts uncomfortably but follows her lead. The unspoken assumption in the air is that someone like Gerald, with his humble demeanor and worn-out briefcase, doesn't belong in a place like Crestwood National Bank. The condescension in their voices is palpable as they question him further. Offering no real help, Gerald, however, remains unshaken. His calmness contrasts sharply with the staff's dismissive tone. Despite the subtle yet clear disrespect, Gerald doesn't let their behavior affect him. He stands tall, composed, and gracious, patiently waiting for the assistance he deserves. This quiet moment sets the stage for what is to come, a story of misjudgment, challenge, and an unexpected revelation. But for now, the elderly man with the briefcase simply smiles, and the bank employees are none the wiser about the truth standing before them. Gerald, ever the picture of patience, pulls out his ID and calmly places it on the counter for Sarah and Jason to examine. The worn edges of his identification card are a testament to the years that have passed. But his name is clear, and his information is legitimate. He watches as Sarah scrutinizes the ID, her expression growing increasingly skeptical. She glances over at Jason, who is already starting to shift uncomfortably. But neither of them says a word. The silent exchange between them speaks volumes. They both seem to believe that Gerald is somehow out of place. Despite the clear evidence in front of them, Sarah's tone hardens. She questions his identity once again, casting doubt on the validity of his account, even though Gerald has been a loyal customer of the bank for more than 2 decades. In her mind, the idea that someone like him could have maintained such an account for so long simply doesn't add up. The harshness in her voice grows more apparent, and Jason's hesitation fades as he, too, starts to question the elderly man's presence. Gerald remains still, his face betraying no emotion. His years of experience have taught him not to let such things rattle him. And he's seen enough in life to know that sometimes, people will judge you based on appearances alone. But the constant questioning wears on him. Sarah, now clearly irritated, takes matters into her own hands. She picks up the phone and calls over the security guard, speaking in a voice that carries a tone of authority and impatience. "Can you escort this gentleman out?" she says, not even waiting for the guard to ask why. The decision has been made, and in her mind, there's no room for discussion. Gerald's case will not be resolved today, and they've made up their minds that he is a disruption. The security guard arrives shortly after, a large, imposing figure whose presence makes the situation feel even more uncomfortable. Gerald doesn't resist. With a deep, resigned breath, he picks up his briefcase and slowly turns to leave. The bank employees continue their work, oblivious to the gravity of what just transpired. They don't realize that they've just dismissed a man who has quietly built a legacy. Someone whose worth can't be measured by appearances or assumptions. As Gerald steps outside, the cool air of the autumn afternoon wraps around him, offering a fleeting moment of solace. He walks away with the same composed demeanor he arrived with, leaving the bank staff unaware of the depth of his history and the significance of the man they so easily dismissed. Their ignorance is their loss. But Gerald knows better. He's faced greater challenges before. And today, though disappointing, is just another chapter in his long and storied life. As the door to Crestwood National Bank swings shut behind Gerald, a heavy silence falls over the room. Sarah and Jason, still caught in their own assumptions, continue to go about their tasks with the casual indifference of those who believe they've won. They exchange a brief, satisfied glance, as if to affirm that the situation is resolved, their decision final. Yet, there's an unspoken tension in the air, a subtle unease that lingers just beneath the surface. Unnoticed by the young employees, Gerald's calmness had been unsettling in its own right, a stark contrast to the ruffled emotions of the staff. To Sarah and Jason, his resignation in the face of their dismissal only reinforces the idea that he didn't belong in their world, but there was more to him than met the eye. As Gerald steps out of the bank, his composed exterior masks a depth of understanding that neither Sarah nor Jason could have ever guessed. He is not just any ordinary customer, and they have failed to grasp the weight of his presence. To them, he is simply an old man with a weathered briefcase. But in reality, Gerald is a man with decades of experience, a man whose life has been intertwined with the fabric of the community in ways they cannot even begin to fathom. He walks down the street, the rhythmic tapping of his shoes on the pavement sounding almost like a quiet echo of his thoughts. He has faced challenges in his life far greater than the dismissive attitudes of a few bank employees. His journey has been one of resilience, of lessons learned through hardship. And he knows that today's treatment is but a small chapter in a much larger story. Yet, despite the coldness he encountered, there's no bitterness in his heart. He understands that the world often judges by appearances and that people are too quick to dismiss what they don't understand. As Gerald disappears around the corner, Sarah and Jason continue with their tasks, unaware that they've just encountered someone whose story is far more significant than their assumptions. Their lack of recognition, though, doesn't faze him. In time, the truth will come to light, but for now, he remains a quiet figure, a man who knows more than they could ever imagine. Moving through a world that will eventually come to understand him, the unease that lingers in the bank's lobby is a subtle reminder that sometimes the most important people are the ones we fail to notice, the ones who carry the wisdom of years. Hidden behind a smile and a briefcase, the morning air is crisp, and the sun casts a soft golden glow over Crestwood National Bank as Gerald, now known as Christopher, steps into the lobby once more. But this time, he isn't here as a regular customer. Today, he walks through the doors as a corporate client with a purpose. His briefcase is still in hand, though today it carries an air of significance that wasn't there before. He is not just any elderly man, he is a man who commands respect. Even if the staff fails to recognize it, Ethan and Sophia, the younger employees now working the counter, are engaged in a lighthearted conversation when they notice Christopher's entrance. His presence is familiar, but the way he carries himself, the confidence in his stride, is not. He approaches the counter calmly, his demeanor unwavering as he asks to open a corporate account. His voice is steady, but beneath it is a quiet authority, the type that comes only with years of experience and a deep understanding of the world. Ethan, with a smirk on his face, looks him up and down. He exchanges a glance with Sophia, who raises an eyebrow in disbelief. Christopher's appearance doesn't align with their expectations of what a corporate client should look like. They are quick to dismiss him again, offering mockery disguised as professionalism. "You must be mistaken, sir. This is a bank for businesses, not casual clients," Ethan says, his voice dripping with condescension. "Perhaps you should try a smaller branch. We only deal with serious accounts here." Sophia, not missing a beat, adds, "Yes, we typically reserve our services for those with a more established track record." Christopher remains unfazed, his calm gaze never wavering. The dismissive tone in their words does not rattle him. He knows the game they're playing, and he understands that their actions are driven by their limited perspective, not his worth. The irony isn't lost on him. They don't realize the weight of what he represents, nor the significance of his request. They think they're in control of the situation, but in reality, they're only making themselves the subjects of an impending lesson. "I'm not mistaken," Christopher replies with a quiet firmness. "I'm here to open a corporate account, and I'd appreciate it if you could assist me." Ethan and Sophia exchange a brief, knowing glance. They are unimpressed by his insistence, interpreting it as the stubbornness of an elderly man who doesn't know his place. With a subtle nod from Ethan, they begin to dismiss him once more, insisting that he leave the counter. As the conversation escalates, the situation grows more uncomfortable. The staff's arrogance and impatience are palpable, and yet, Christopher's resolve remains unbroken. He stands tall, unwavering in the face of their mockery. Despite the sting of their words, he maintains his composure, showing no sign of frustration. To them, He is a nuisance, an inconsequential man, but in reality, they are on the verge of making a monumental mistake, one they will soon regret. The tension in the air is thick, and the exchange continues to spiral as the staff refuses to assist him. Yet, the true weight of the situation is lost on Ethan and Sophia. They fail to see that the man before them is not someone they can easily dismiss. Not someone who will simply walk away defeated. Christopher's presence is more than they can comprehend, and in their short-sightedness, they continue to push him to the edge. As he finally turns to leave, a quiet, steady calmness surrounding him, Christopher knows this encounter is only the beginning. He has endured much worse in his life, and these two young bankers are nothing more than a fleeting obstacle on his path. They will come to understand their mistake soon enough. But for now, Christopher exits with the same dignity he entered with, and a quiet, knowing smile plays at the corners of his lips. Ethan and Sophia, oblivious to the significance of this moment, go on with their day, unaware that their attitudes will soon be the subject of a lesson they will never forget. The air in Crestwood National Bank has thickened with tension, a palpable unease that seems to reverberate in the hallways. Christopher, now standing at the center of the conflict, remains calm, his face a mask of serenity that belies the storm of thoughts swirling in his mind. His experience has taught him that the most powerful response in moments of adversity is often the quietest one. As Ethan and Sophia continue to push him away, Mia, a young junior banker who has been quietly observing from the side, finally steps forward. Her gaze is sharp, noticing the way Christopher carries himself with dignity despite the treatment he's received. There's something in his demeanor that stands out to her, a wisdom and quiet authority that her colleagues seem to be missing entirely. She takes a deep breath and, despite her hesitation, speaks up. "Wait a moment," Mia says, her voice cutting through the tension. "Before we dismiss him entirely, perhaps we should review his documents and verify his account history. It might be worth checking to see if there's more to this situation than we're assuming." Ethan and Sophia exchange a glance, their skepticism still evident in their expressions. They're not used to being challenged by a junior employee, and the thought of backing down doesn't sit well with them. They are quick to dismiss Mia's suggestion. "Really, Mia?" Ethan says, rolling his eyes. "You want to waste our time with this guy? He's clearly not who he says he is." Sophia laughs, a thin, mocking sound that barely conceals her irritation. "I agree, he's probably just a confused old man who doesn't know the first thing about corporate banking." But Mia isn't so easily deterred. She stands her ground, her gaze unwavering as she addresses Christopher. "I'm sorry for the misunderstanding. Sir, please, allow me to check your documents, just to ensure we have all the information right." Christopher regards Mia for a long moment, studying her face carefully. There is something sincere in her voice, a level of empathy that stands in stark contrast to her colleagues' dismissive attitudes. He doesn't respond immediately, instead choosing to weigh the situation. The last thing he wants is to escalate the conflict further. The power of patience, he knows, can often be the most effective weapon. He finally nods, his voice calm but filled with quiet gratitude. "Thank you," he says softly, withdrawing slightly. "I appreciate your willingness to take the time to check. There's no need for any trouble." Mia moves to the side, signaling for him to follow her. She guides him toward a more private section of the bank, away from the prying eyes and critical glances of her colleagues. She motions for him to take a seat, and as she begins to review his paperwork, Christopher's mind drifts for a moment, reflecting on the years that have passed and the journey that has led him to this moment. Despite the dismissals and mockery, he has learned to find peace in moments like this. The world may not always see his worth, but he knows the value of persistence. He remains grounded, his patience unmatched, knowing that every challenge he faces is just another step on the path toward a greater goal. As Mia sifts through his documents, she begins to understand the weight of the situation more clearly. The more she looks, the more she realizes that Christopher's story is not one of a confused old man, but of a seasoned businessman with years of experience. His account history stretches back decades, filled with numerous successful transactions and dealings. There are records of corporate investments, charitable contributions, and personal achievements that speak volumes about his integrity and standing in the business world. Mia's eyes widen in realization. This is no ordinary man. She had sensed as much. But now the evidence is irrefutable. She takes a deep breath, a mixture of awe and nervousness coursing through her as she prepares to approach her colleagues with the truth. But before she can speak, Christopher looks at her, a knowing smile on his face. Thank you for your patience. Mia, he says quietly. I didn't expect much from them. But your approach is appreciated. Mia looks up at him, feeling a deep sense of respect for the man before her. She has learned more in these few moments than she ever anticipated. With a quick glance back at Ethan and Sophia, who are still oblivious to the unfolding revelation, Mia makes a decision. I'll make sure your account is handled properly. Mr. Caldwell, she says, her voice firm with newfound confidence. I'll personally ensure that everything is taken care of. Christopher nods once more, his calm demeanor never faltering. The ordeal is far from over. But at least, for now, there is a glimmer of hope that things may soon be put right. As Mia begins processing his request, Christopher quietly exits the scene, knowing that this chapter of the story is but a small part of a much larger narrative. One that, with patience and understanding, is steadily unfolding. The aftermath of the incident at Crestwood National Bank ripples through the organization, leaving a mark that would take time to heal. Amanda and Patrick, two of the bankers who had so casually dismissed Christopher, are called into the HR office one morning, their expressions a mixture of confusion and apprehension. They have no idea what's coming next. Unaware that their actions have triggered more than just a brief conflict, they have set into motion a process that will force them to confront something deeper. Something uncomfortable. The bank, in its efforts to address the growing concerns about bias and discrimination, has made it clear that these behaviors will not be tolerated, as part of a broader initiative to foster a more inclusive and respectful environment. Amanda and Patrick are enrolled in mandatory anti-racism therapy. The initial reaction from both of them is one of resistance. They find the idea of therapy, particularly one focused on racism, to be something foreign. Perhaps even unnecessary. They have always prided themselves on being fair and professional, believing that their actions, however dismissive, were nothing more than a series of misunderstandings or coincidences. After all, they had assumed that Christopher was just another old man confused by the modern banking system. But as the sessions begin, it quickly becomes clear that this was far from the truth. The therapy sessions are led by a seasoned facilitator, someone with a deep understanding of both institutional bias and the personal struggles that often come with addressing one's own prejudices. The sessions start gently, with discussions about personal experiences and subtle biases that can creep into everyday interactions. But as the weeks progress, the conversations become more difficult. Amanda and Patrick are forced to look inward, to reflect on the assumptions they had made about Christopher simply because of his age, race, and appearance. At first, both are defensive. Amanda speaks about how she was simply trying to do her job efficiently, and Patrick justifies his actions by claiming that he was just following protocol. They resist the idea that their behavior could have been anything other than an honest mistake. But the facilitator challenges them, pointing out the ways in which their responses to Christopher were not just based on a misunderstanding of his financial situation but also on deeply ingrained stereotypes about black men, elderly people, and the way they are perceived in a corporate setting. As the therapy progresses, Amanda and Patrick begin to hear stories from their fellow participants, stories from people who have been marginalized, overlooked, and misunderstood in the same ways. They begin to see the subtle ways in which their actions perpetuated harm. Even if they didn't fully understand it at the time, the realization hits Patrick first. One day, as they sit in a circle, the facilitator asks the group to consider a simple question. What if Christopher had been a different person? What if he had been someone who didn't possess the quiet dignity that Christopher had shown? Someone who might have reacted more aggressively to the mistreatment? How might that have changed the outcome? Patrick sits in silence, his mind racing. He begins to feel the weight of his own assumptions, the way he had looked at Christopher and made decisions about him based on his appearance alone. He feels a pang of guilt that he hadn't even considered how a person might feel in that situation. How his assumptions could have shaped the outcome in ways he hadn't anticipated. Amanda, too, begins to shift. She recalls the way she had dismissed Christopher so easily, assuming that his requests were inconsequential simply because he didn't fit the typical profile of a corporate client. She had been so focused on the task at hand that she had failed to recognize the human being standing in front of her. Slowly, both Amanda and Patrick begin to open up during the sessions, admitting their discomfort with the process. They begin to share their stories of how they had been raised, the biases they had inherited from their families, and the ways those biases had shaped their interactions with others. They don't absolve themselves of their actions, but they start to understand that bias isn't always something one is consciously aware of. It is often insidious, woven into the very fabric of society. And it takes work to unravel. As they continue the therapy, Amanda and Patrick come to terms with the impact of their behavior. They realize that their dismissiveness wasn't just a minor mistake, it was an example of how bias can perpetuate a cycle of harm and division. They see how the simple act of listening, truly listening, could have changed everything for Christopher. The final session is emotional for both of them. They apologize to each other, to the group, and most importantly, to Christopher. Though they have no way of directly contacting him, they realize that their journey toward understanding is just beginning, and that real change requires continuous self-reflection and action. In the weeks that follow, Amanda and Patrick's behavior shifts. They are more attentive with clients, more open-minded in their approach to customers, and more conscious of their actions. They learn to check their biases, not just in the office, but in their personal lives as well. While the process is far from perfect, the two bankers begin to understand the gravity of their past actions. They know they cannot undo the harm they caused Christopher, but they can ensure that no one else is treated in the same way. Their growth, though slow, is a testament to the power of self-awareness and the possibility of change, even when it feels uncomfortable. And somewhere, out there, Christopher continues his journey, his quiet resilience having sparked a shift that no one could have anticipated. The weeks following the start of their mandatory anti-racism therapy are difficult for both Amanda and Patrick. The sessions, led by a skilled facilitator, become an emotional and intellectual journey for them, one that challenges their core beliefs and forces them to confront a reality they had long ignored. In the beginning, both of them resented the process. Amanda felt embarrassed by the idea that her well-intentioned actions could be misinterpreted as bias. And Patrick felt defensive, convinced that he was simply following standard procedures. However, as the therapy sessions continued, they were slowly peeled back layer by layer. The facilitators encouraged them to share their personal experiences, to talk about their upbringing, and to reflect on the subtle ways in which bias creeps into everyday life. At first, their discomfort was palpable. They would often look at each other in silence, struggling to articulate the unease they felt. But as the weeks went on, their defensiveness began to crumble. Amanda, who had once believed that people should just get over misunderstandings, began to understand that the harm caused by biased actions runs deeper than simple mistakes. It was about the patterns that have been ingrained in society for generations, a system where the dignity and worth of some people are questioned based on race, age, or appearance. Patrick, too, began to realize that his assumption about Christopher wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a larger, systemic problem that affected the way people like him interacted with those from different backgrounds. He began to understand that his behavior wasn't merely the result of a lapse in judgment, but a product of years of social conditioning. As they delved deeper into their own histories, they began to recognize moments in their lives when they had unconsciously made similar judgments about others. Whether it was at work, in social settings, or even within their families, each realization stung, and both Amanda and Patrick began to feel the weight of their own shortcomings. But as painful as these revelations were, they were also necessary. They began to see the world through a different lens, one that made them more attuned to the subtle injustices that occur daily. This awareness, while uncomfortable, was the key to breaking down the walls of their own biases. In one particularly eye-opening session, they were asked to discuss what it felt like to be othered, to feel invisible, judged, or dismissed based on superficial traits. It was a question that neither Amanda nor Patrick had considered before, but it struck them deeply. The facilitator invited them to step into the shoes of someone who might have experienced discrimination, forcing them to acknowledge what it might feel like to be treated as less than, to be dismissed without even a second thought. Amanda, in particular, was moved by this exercise. She began to imagine what it would have felt like if, instead of Christopher, the man who had been turned away had been someone who was much more vocal in expressing his dissatisfaction, someone who had less patience with the unfair treatment. The consequences could have been disastrous. She realized that in their rush to judge, they had failed to see the humanity in the person standing before them. It wasn't just a case of poor customer service, it was a reflection of a larger societal issue that needed to be addressed. Patrick also had his moments of reckoning. One afternoon, during a particularly candid session, he shared how he had grown up in a family where certain stereotypes were openly accepted. He had heard them all, that older people didn't know how to handle technology, that people of different races were somehow different from him, and that people from certain neighborhoods could never be wealthy or successful. It was shocking for him to admit that, even as an adult, he had never questioned those beliefs until now. He had lived in a bubble of comfort, where his worldview had never been challenged. As the sessions went on, the change in Amanda and Patrick became more evident. Their language softened, their interactions with others became more open, and their approach to clients and colleagues shifted. Amanda started to listen more attentively to others, particularly those from different backgrounds. She no longer dismissed ideas or people who didn't fit her preconceived notions. She began to ask more questions, to genuinely seek to understand the experiences of those around her. Patrick, too, showed signs of growth. He started to actively question his own assumptions about the people he worked with and the clients he served. He began to realize that his position as a banker had given him a certain privilege. And with that privilege came a responsibility to do better, not just for his career, but for the people he interacted with every day. Though neither of them was perfect, both Amanda and Patrick were beginning to understand the importance of empathy and awareness in their roles. They had come to realize that the road to change wasn't a straight line, it was messy, uncomfortable, and filled with setbacks, but it was a road worth traveling, not just for themselves, but for the world around them. By the end of their therapy, Amanda and Patrick had gained a new perspective on their place in the world. They no longer saw themselves as passive participants in a system of inequality, but as active agents of change. They understood that while they could never fully undo the harm they had caused Christopher, they could ensure that such biases would not govern their actions in the future. As they walked out of their final session, there was a quiet sense of resolution in the air. They knew that their journey was far from over, but they were ready to face the future with a renewed commitment to treating everyone with the respect and dignity they deserved, no exceptions. The road to change, though long and difficult, had begun. After weeks of reflection, therapy, and growth, Amanda and Patrick knew they had to face the man they had wronged. It had been a difficult journey, but the lessons learned had transformed them. They now understood that words alone could not undo the damage they had caused. They needed to demonstrate the sincerity of their change through their actions. Together, they requested a meeting with Christopher. It was a bold step, one they knew wouldn't erase the past, but it was a necessary one. They understood that the apology they owed him had to come from a place of true remorse, and that meant confronting their mistakes head-on. When Christopher agreed to meet with them, he did so without the anger or resentment they feared. Instead, he greeted them with the same calm demeanor that had marked their first encounter. He listened attentively as Amanda spoke first, her voice tinged with both regret and sincerity. "Aaron, Patrick," she began, her tone measured but vulnerable. "I want to start by saying how deeply sorry I am for the way we treated you. We were wrong, and there's no excuse for our behavior. I see now how our actions hurt you, and I'm truly sorry." Patrick, standing beside her, added, "I can't undo the damage I've caused, but I want you to know that I've learned a lot from this experience. The way I dismissed you, I see now how much harm that can cause, and I promise to never make those assumptions again, not just about you but about anyone." There was a long pause as Christopher absorbed their words. His expression remained steady, though his eyes seemed to gleam with a mixture of understanding and guarded wisdom. He finally spoke, his voice calm and clear, but carrying the weight of a man who had lived through his own share of hardships. "I appreciate your apology," Christopher said slowly, "but let me remind you of something important. Apologies are only meaningful when they are backed by change. Words without actions are just empty promises. What matters now is how you prove your growth, not just to me, but to the world around you." Amanda and Patrick both nodded solemnly, understanding the truth in Christopher's words. He had always been more interested in how they would change than in receiving a simple apology. His wisdom wasn't lost on them, and they knew that their work wasn't finished. "You're right," Amanda said, her voice firm now. "This isn't about making things right through words. It's about showing you, and others, that we've changed. We'll work hard to demonstrate that. Every day." Patrick's gaze shifted slightly, but there was a newfound humility in it. "We will do better. That's not just a promise. It's a commitment to make amends in our actions moving forward." Christopher studied them for a moment, as if weighing their sincerity. Then, with a slight nod, he responded, "I can see you've learned something from this. It's not about me, it's about the respect and dignity you give to everyone, no matter their background or appearance. I hope you carry that lesson with you in everything you do." Amanda and Patrick both nodded, a deep sense of gratitude and responsibility settling over them. Christopher's words weren't just about the apology, they were a reminder of the deeper work that needed to be done. Not just within themselves but within society. He wasn't asking for perfection, but for growth, for them to actively become the change they sought to see in the world. The meeting concluded with a mutual understanding between the three of them. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic moments, just a quiet acknowledgement of the long road ahead. Amanda and Patrick left the meeting with a renewed sense of purpose. They knew they couldn't undo the past, but they had taken the first step toward earning back their integrity. As for Christopher, he felt a weight lifted from his shoulders. While the apology wasn't the final answer, it was a step in the right direction. He had witnessed their transformation, and he knew that real change had begun. In the end, the most meaningful aspect of the encounter wasn't the apology itself but the growth that came from it. Actions, as Christopher had said, spoke louder than words. Amanda and Patrick had learned that lesson well, and with that knowledge, they were ready to continue on their journey, proving through their deeds that they were no longer the people who had once dismissed Christopher. They were better. Months had passed since the pivotal meeting between Christopher, Amanda, and Patrick, and the atmosphere at Crestwood National Bank had undergone a profound transformation. What was once a place where assumptions and prejudices had thrived, now stood as a model of growth, reflection, and understanding. The journey had been long, but it had led to something powerful, a tangible shift in both attitudes and actions. Christopher, ever the quiet leader, had continued to guide the process of change. His wisdom had been a beacon for those willing to look inward and confront their biases. But he wasn't one to take credit for the success. Instead, he focused on the collective progress, knowing that true change was a shared responsibility. To mark the progress they had made as an institution, Christopher decided to host a gathering at the bank. The event wasn't meant to be a grand celebration, but rather a reflection of the lessons learned and the work still to be done. Amanda and Patrick, now visibly changed, were invited to speak and share their personal stories. The gathering took place in the bank's conference room, which had been decorated simply but with thoughtfulness. The employees, some of whom had initially been skeptical of the changes, now filled the room, eager to hear from those who had led the charge. There was a palpable sense of anticipation in the air, as people recognized that this wasn't just another meeting, it was an opportunity for reflection, learning, and growth. As Amanda and Patrick took the stage, they stood side by side. Gone were the airs of arrogance and superiority that once defined them. Instead, they spoke with sincerity, sharing the lessons they had learned through their therapy, their self-reflection, and the humbling journey they had undertaken. Amanda spoke first. "I'll be honest, when I first encountered Christopher, I didn't see him as I should have. I saw him through the lens of assumptions, biases, and yes, even ignorance. But I've learned that we all carry biases, and they don't just harm others, they harm us too. What we do with that awareness, how we choose to act moving forward, is what matters most." Patrick continued, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I was ashamed of the way I treated Christopher. But what I didn't realize was how much shame could turn into a powerful force for change. We can either let our mistakes define us, or we can use them to transform ourselves and the world around us. I'm grateful for the lessons Christopher taught me, not just through words, but through his actions and his forgiveness." The room was silent, hanging on their every word. It was clear that their stories resonated with the audience. There was no pretending, no sugarcoating, just a raw, authentic sharing of their journey. The vulnerability they exhibited was the true heart of the gathering. Christopher, sitting at the back of the room, listened intently. He had always believed that leadership wasn't about holding power over others, but about empowering them to become the best versions of themselves. He had seen Amanda and Patrick grow, and now, through their words, they were empowering the entire bank to do the same. The gathering ended with a call to action. Christopher, Amanda, and Patrick spoke about the bank's new diversity training programs, initiatives designed to promote inclusion, empathy, and self-awareness. These programs would go beyond surface-level discussions and delve into the deep work of confronting biases, unlearning harmful behaviors, and actively creating an environment where everyone felt seen and valued. The change didn't stop with the gathering. It sparked a movement within the bank, as employees from all departments came together to engage in open dialogues, share experiences, and work collaboratively to foster a culture of respect. The bank's leadership began to take proactive steps, not just in addressing biases, but in celebrating diversity in all its forms. As months turned into years, the positive changes continued to take root. The once toxic atmosphere of prejudice and exclusion had given way to one of respect, support, and empowerment. Christopher's legacy was now firmly established, not just as a man who had challenged the system, but as a symbol of what true leadership looked like. In the end, the most lasting impact wasn't the programs implemented or the policies created. It was the transformation within the people themselves, the employees who had once dismissed others, but now carried with them a deeper sense of empathy and understanding. It was a bank where every individual, regardless of their background, felt like they belonged. Christopher's quiet strength had sparked a ripple effect, one that would continue to reverberate through the institution for years to come. And as he looked around the room, filled with people who had learned and grown, he knew that the real legacy of leadership wasn't about titles or accolades. It was about the hearts and minds that had been changed, and the future they would now build together, a future where respect, dignity, and inclusion were not just ideals, but a way of life. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Stay tuned for more exciting content. And remember, the best is yet to come. Take care and see you in the next one.